30 Iranian fast boats, 1 United States Navy carrier strike group. On paper, the result looks obvious. But naval analysts who have modeled this scenario consistently reach a different and more unsettling conclusion. If this engagement were to occur in the narrow, congested waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the traditional advantages of a carrier strike group range, power, and high-altitude surveillance would likely be compressed by geography. In this scenario, the distance between the Iranian coast and the carrier's hull is often less than 25 miles. This proximity would give the United States Navy very little time to react to an escalating threat. The key question this analysis examines is not whether the United States could win a war against Iran, but whether a specifically engineered swarm of low-cost assets could achieve a mission kill on a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier. A mission kill does not mean the ship is sunk. It means the carrier is rendered unable to launch aircraft, effectively removing it from the fight and dealing a massive symbolic and strategic blow. Defense analysts have modeled this engagement as a test of saturation. Every defensive system, no matter how advanced, has a limit to how many targets it can track and engage at a single time. If an adversary launches more threats than the defending ship has fire channels to manage, some of those threats, known as leakers, will inevitably get through. In this hypothetical engagement, we are analyzing the meeting of two very different military philosophies. On one side is the Aegis combat system, a marvel of high technology designed to defend against sophisticated Soviet-era missile barrages. On the other side is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy doctrine of asymmetric swarming. This doctrine does not rely on a single, powerful weapon. Instead, it relies on the chaos of 100 small problems arriving at the same moment. Analysts suggest that in the opening minutes of such a conflict, the United States Navy would likely face a three-layered threat. First, a swarm of fast attack craft armed with heavy machine guns and short-range rockets. Second, a coordinated volley of land-based anti-ship cruise missiles launched from hidden mobile batteries along the coast. Third, the potential use of explosive-laden unmanned surface vessels. The complexity of this scenario is compounded by the presence of hundreds of civilian tankers and fishing vessels in the area. This clutter would likely make it extremely difficult for radar operators on a United States destroyer to distinguish between a harmless dhow and a fast boat carrying a high-explosive payload until the threat was within a few miles. Wargame models predict that the outcome of this engagement would depend entirely on the first 120 seconds of kinetic contact. If the carriers escorting destroyers can maintain a clear perimeter, the carrier survives. If the swarm can penetrate the inner layer of the screen, the entire tactical calculus changes. In the following parts of this analysis, we will examine the specific capabilities of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and the FA-18 Super Hornet against the specific tactics of the Iranian fast-boat flotillas. We will look at how the Aegis combat system would likely handle a high-density target environment and where the potential gaps in that defense might be exploited. This analysis is based on publicly available information and known military doctrine. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, such as the quality of individual leadership and the unpredictable nature of electronic warfare in a confined space. In this hypothetical engagement, the defense of the aircraft carrier would likely rest on the most sophisticated integrated air defense network ever deployed at sea. The primary shield is the Aegis combat system, centered on the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers that screen the carrier. This system is designed to provide a layered defense, intended to neutralize threats long before they can reach the carrier's hull. At the outermost edge of this shield, the E-2 Delta Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft would provide the eyes of the fleet flying high above the Strait of Hormuz. Its powerful radar would attempt to track hundreds of surface and air contacts simultaneously. In this scenario, the E-2 Delta would be responsible for identifying the emergence of a swarm from Iranian ports and directing the carrier's air wing to intercept. The first layer of active defense would likely be provided by FA-18 Super Hornet fighters in a hypothetical saturation attack. These aircraft would be tasked with engaging Iranian fast boats and missile launchers with precision-guided munitions from a distance. However, defense analysts have noted that in the confined geography of the strait, the flight time for an incoming missile could be as little as 2 minutes, leaving the air wing with a very narrow window to intervene. If the swarm or incoming missiles were to bypass the outer air screen, the burden would shift to the destroyer's vertical launch systems. Analysts believe the Standard Missile 6 and Standard Missile 2 would be the primary interceptors used against high-speed anti-ship cruise missiles. These interceptors are highly capable, but they represent a finite resource. Each destroyer carries a specific number of missiles, and in this scenario, a massive Iranian volley would be designed specifically to deplete these magazines. As the engagement defense, the evolved Sea Sparrow missile and the rolling airframe missile would come into play. These systems are designed high-speed intercepts. If this scenario were to unfold, the Aegis system's ability to manage fire channels, the number of simultaneous terminal guidance signals it can provide to its own missiles, would be tested to its absolute limit. Most visceral layer of defense is the close-in weapon system, often referred to as the phalanx. This radar-controlled 20mm Gatling gun is designed to shred any missile or small boat that survives the outer layers of defense. In this hypothetical, multiple close-in weapon systems firing simultaneously would signal that the swarm had successfully penetrated the inner perimeter of the strike group. Despite this formidable technology, United States Navy doctrine acknowledges significant vulnerabilities in this shield. The primary concern is magazine depth. If the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy were to launch 50 missiles and 100 fast boats, the strike group might simply run out of interceptors. Furthermore, the ANSPY-1 or ANSPY-6 radars on the destroyers can be challenged by clutter. The radar reflections from the nearby rugged coastline and waves, which can hide small, low-profile fast boats. In this analysis, the United States shield is treated as a highly professional and technically superior system, but one that is not invincible. It is a system designed for open ocean warfare, now forced to operate in a knife-fight environment where the distance between the predator and the prey is dangerously short. In this hypothetical scenario, the adversary is not attempting to match the United States Navy ship for ship or missile for missile. Instead, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy employs a doctrine known as asymmetric swarming. This strategy is specifically engineered to exploit the high-tech, high-cost nature of Western naval defense by using a massive volume of low-cost, expendable platforms. Analysts believe this doctrine is not a sign of primitive capability, but rather a sophisticated response to the overwhelming firepower of a carrier strike group. The primary tool of this doctrine is the fast attack craft. In this analysis, we would likely see dozens of these small, highly maneuverable vessels, some no longer than 30 or 40 feet, operating in coordinated groups. These boats are often armed with heavy machine guns, multiple launch rocket systems, or even short-range anti-ship missiles like the Kosar or Nasser. While a single boat poses little threat to a destroyer, 30 boats approaching from multiple vectors create a target assignment nightmare for the Aegis combat system. War game models suggest that the Iranian swarm would likely use the rugged, indented coastline of the Strait of Hormuz to its advantage. Unlike the United States vessels, which must remain in deeper shipping lanes, Iranian fast boats can hide in small coves, behind islands, or even in specially designed underground ship cities carved into the coastal cliffs. This allows them to launch an attack with almost no warning, emerging from the radar shadows of the land and closing the distance to the carrier in a matter of minutes. Beyond the boats themselves, Iranian doctrine calls for the heavy use of land-based anti-ship cruise missiles. Analysts note that systems such as the Noor and the Ghadir, based on established international designs, provide a long-reach capability that can be launched from mobile trucks. These trucks can move into position, fire, and relocate before a United States counterstrike can be organized. In a hypothetical engagement, these missiles would likely be timed to arrive at the same moment the fast boat swarm reaches the outer perimeter of the strike group. One of the most dangerous elements of this doctrine is the suicide or one-way unmanned surface vessel. These are essentially remote-controlled boats packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosives. Because they have a very low profile in the water, they are difficult to detect on radar, especially in the clutter of a busy waterway. If this scenario were to unfold, these unmanned vessels would likely be hidden within the larger swarm of manned fast boats, acting as kinetic torpedoes intended to strike the carrier's waterline. Defense analysts have noted that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy trains its crews for high-risk, aggressive maneuvering. This is not a disorganized force. It is a professionalized branch of the Iranian military that views its mission through the lens of coastal defense and regional deterrence. Their doctrine emphasizes the first salvo advantage. They understand that, in modern naval warfare, the side that fires first and with the most volume often dictates the outcome of the entire engagement. In this analysis, the swarm is treated as a highly credible threat specifically designed to create cognitive overload for the tactical action officers on a United States destroyer. The goal is to force the defenders to make impossible choices. Which boat is a decoy? Which boat is the suicide craft? Which incoming missile must be engaged first? By forcing the United States Navy to expend its limited supply of expensive interceptors on cheap targets. The swarm attempts to strip away the carrier's shield, one layer at a time. This strategy acknowledges that while the United States holds a massive technological advantage, that advantage can be neutralized by the sheer physics of numbers and geography. If this scenario were to occur, the Iranian forces would likely accept extremely high casualty rates in exchange for the chance to land even a single significant hit on a capital ship. In the language of asymmetric warfare, the loss of 50 fast boats is a tactical victory if it results in the mission killing of a single aircraft carrier. In this hypothetical engagement, the transition from a state of high tension to active combat would likely be blurred by what analysts call the gray zone. This is a period where the intent of the adversary is masked by everyday maritime activity. If this scenario were to unfold in the Strait of Hormuz, the first challenge for the carrier strike group would not be a lack of information, but an overwhelming abundance of it. Wargame analysts suggest that the engagement would likely begin with a series of aggressive maneuvers by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Dozens of fast boats would likely emerge from coastal inlets, weaving between commercial tankers and fishing dhows. On the radar screens of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, these boats would initially appear as tiny, intermittent blips amidst the massive radar returns of steel-hulled merchant ships. In this scenario, the carrier group commander would face a critical decision point regarding the rules of engagement. Under United States Navy doctrine, commanders have the inherent right to self-defense if they perceive hostile intent. However, in a crowded waterway, defining that intent is notoriously difficult. If the fast boats were to close within 5 miles while maintaining high speed, the tactical action officer would have to decide whether to wait for a hostile act, such as a weapon launch, or to fire first to protect the carrier. Analysis suggests that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely use this ambiguity to their advantage. They would likely attempt to surround the strike group from multiple directions, creating a 360-degree threat environment. This maneuver is designed to fix the destroyers in place, forcing them to point their sensors and weapons in every direction at once, thereby diluting their defensive focus. Simultaneously, the electronic environment would likely become a battlefield of its own. Analysts believe that Iranian forces would likely employ land-based jamming stations to interfere with the carrier group's satellite communications and tactical data links. If this were to occur, the destroyers would be forced to rely on their own organic sensors, such as the ANSPY-1 or ANSPY-6 radar systems, reducing the overall cohesion of the layered defense. High above the water, the E-2 Delta Hawkeye would be working to build a composite track of the entire swarm. In this hypothetical phase, the crew of the Hawkeye would likely be shouting to be heard over the hum of the electronics, trying to relay targeting data to the FA-18 Super Hornets circling on Cap, the combat air patrol. The goal would be to identify which of the dozens of boats are the command vessels or those carrying the most dangerous missile payloads. As the distance closes to 10 miles, the tension within the strike group would reach a breaking point, based on historical precedent in naval exercises. This is where the first shot dilemma becomes acute. If the United States Navy fires first, they risk an international incident with a potentially non-hostile vessel. If they wait, they risk allowing a suicide craft to reach a distance where it cannot be stopped. Analysts believe the engagement would likely turn kinetic the moment an Iranian vessel crosses a pass. Predetermined deadline. This is a hypothetical boundary, perhaps 5,000 yards from the carrier's screen, where any approaching vessel is treated as a high-priority threat. The first weapon fired would likely be the 5-inch deck gun of a destroyer, intended as a warning shot. That would almost certainly be followed by a lethal engagement if the swarm did not veer away. In this analysis phase, one ends not with a decisive blow, but with the collapse of uncertainty. The moment the first missile is launched or the first deck gun fires, the gray zone vanishes, and the strike group is forced into a full-scale defensive posture against a saturation attack that has already achieved its primary goal, getting close enough to matter. In this hypothetical scenario, the transition from posturing to active engagement would likely be marked by a pulsed saturation attack. Naval doctrine suggests that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would not launch their assets in a steady stream, but would instead attempt to time the arrival of diverse threats to coincide at a single, critical moment. This is designed to create a bottleneck in the carrier group's defensive processing power. If this scenario were to unfold, the escalation would likely begin with the launch of land-based anti-ship cruise missiles from mobile batteries hidden along the Iranian coastline. Analysis suggests that missiles like the Noor or the high-speed Ghadir would be fired in a coordinated volley. These missiles are designed to skim just above the wavetops, making them difficult for the destroyer's SPR and SPY-6 radars to detect until they crest the horizon. The purpose of this initial salvo is not necessarily to sink the carrier, but to force the Aegis-equipped destroyers to commit their long-range Standard Missile-6 interceptors and lock their fire control radars onto high-altitude threats. While the destroyers are focused on the missile threat from the land, the surface swarm would likely accelerate. In this hypothetical engagement, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely employ a tactic known as manned-unmanned teaming. In this configuration, larger Zulfikar fast attack craft would act as motherships, providing local command and control for several Yamadi explosive-laden unmanned surface vessels. These unmanned craft are essentially kinetic torpedoes that can be directed toward the carrier's waterline from within the chaos of the larger formation. Defense analysts believe the United States Navy would respond with its own layered counter-swarm technologies. In this scenario, the destroyers would likely deploy the Coyote drone interceptor. These are small, tube-launched drones that can be fired from the ship's deck to loiter over the water, searching for incoming fast boats. If a threat is identified, the Coyote would likely detonate a fragmentation warhead in the air, creating a shredding effect intended to disable the bot, engines, and guidance systems of multiple small boats at once. As the distance between the forces closes to less than 10 miles, the intensity of the engagement would likely reach a fever pitch. The carriers escorting destroyers would be forced to cycle through their vertical launch system cells at a rapid rate. Analysts note that while a single destroyer may carry over 90 missile cells, only a fraction of those are dedicated to short-range defense. In this hypothetical, the quad-packed Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles would be the primary defense against the incoming cruise missiles, while the rolling airframe missile systems would focus on the closest surface threats. A critical point of analysis in this scenario is the fire channel limitation of older Aegis variants. Each time a destroyer engages a target with a semi-active missile, it must illuminate that target with a dedicated radar beam. If there are 30 targets and only 4 illuminators, the ship is forced to engage threats sequentially rather than simultaneously. While newer Aegis versions with active seekers like the Standard Missile 6 reduce this problem, the sheer density of a 30-boat swarm combined with a 10-missile volley would likely push the system to its physical threshold. In this scenario, we would likely see the introduction of Marine Air Defense Integrated Systems, or MADIS, positioned along the carrier's catwalks and the decks of the escort ships. These units, operated by embarked United States Marines, provide an additional layer of electronic jamming and shoulder-fired kinetic interceptors. This is an example of distributed defense, where every platform in the strike group, not just the destroyers, contributes to the survival of the carrier. Wargame models suggest that at this stage, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely begin taking massive losses. The FA-18 Super Hornets on combat air patrol would likely be Winchester, meaning out of ammunition after the first few minutes of the engagement, having used their Hellfire missiles and laser-guided bombs to neutralize the lead elements of the swarm. However, the doctrine of the swarm accepts these losses as a necessary cost to allow the leakers to reach the inner defensive ring. This phase of the engagement represents the moment where military doctrine meets the unforgiving physics of time and distance. In a waterway as narrow as the Strait of Hormuz, there is no room for error. Every missile that misses its target and every sensor that fails to track a low-profile boat increases the probability that a hit will be sustained. This is the saturation threshold. And in this analysis, the outcome of the battle is decided by whether the United States shield can hold for just 60 seconds longer than the swarm can maintain its momentum. In this hypothetical engagement, the critical moment would likely occur when the defensive layers of the carrier strike group transition from long-range interception to point defense. This is the breakpoint that naval analysts have studied for decades. It is the moment where the number of incoming threats potentially exceeds the fire channel capacity of the defending destroyers. If this scenario were to unfold, the tactical action officers on the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers would be forced to make life-or-death decisions in a fraction of a second. Analysis suggests that the most dangerous point of the engagement would be when the Iranian swarm closes to within 4 miles. At this distance, the time between a weapon launch and impact is measured in seconds, not minutes. Wargame models indicate that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely attempt a multi-axis maneuver where fast boats and land-based cruise missiles arrive from different bearings simultaneously. This is designed to force the AN/SPY-6 radar to split its processing power across a 360-degree arc. If this engagement were to occur, a significant vulnerability would likely emerge in the sensor-to-shooter loop. Each Standard Missile 2 or Standard Missile 6 launched by a destroyer requires a specific amount of data to hit its target. While modern systems are highly automated, they are still bound by the laws of physics. If 30 fast boats are weaving through the water at 40 knots while 10 cruise missiles are diving from the clouds, the Aegis combat system would likely prioritize the missiles as the higher lethality threat. This would potentially leave a window of opportunity for the surface-based swarm to penetrate the inner screen. In this scenario, the carrier itself would be forced to deploy its own organic defenses. The rolling airframe missile launchers located on the carrier's sponsons would likely begin firing in rapid succession. Analysts believe the critical moment would be defined by the leaker phenomenon. In military terminology, a leaker is a threat that survives all outer defensive layers. Even with a 95% successful intercept rate, in a swarm of 100 threats, 5 would likely reach the target. The turning point of the engagement would likely hinge on the performance of the close-in weapon system. As the surviving fast boats and suicide unmanned vessels enter the 1,000-yard range, the radar-controlled 20mm Gatling guns would activate. In this hypothetical, the sheer volume of fire, 4,500 rounds per minute, would create a wall of lead. However, defense. Analysts note that while the close-in weapon system is highly effective at shredding a single target, it can only engage one target at a time. If 3 suicide boats approach from different angles, the system would likely be unable to neutralize all of them before the first one makes impact. Furthermore, analysis suggests that the physical size of the carrier, over 1,000 feet long, makes it a difficult target to miss, but an easy target to saturate. If the escorting destroyers are forced to maneuver aggressively to avoid incoming missiles, they might inadvertently create shadow zones where their sensors cannot see the boats approaching the carrier from the opposite side. This loss of mutual support is what wargame analysts fear most. In this analysis, the critical moment is not a single explosion, but the collapse of the defensive bubble. If the swarm manages to draw the escorts away from the carrier or deplete their ready-to-fire ammunition, the carrier becomes vulnerable to a mission kill. A mission kill in this scenario would likely result from a hit to the flight deck, the catapults, or the hangar bay. Such damage would not sink the ship, but it would effectively end the carrier's ability to participate in the conflict, achieving the primary strategic objective of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. This moment would likely be the most chaotic and violent 60 seconds of the entire engagement. The success or failure of the United States defense would depend on whether the integrated part of the integrated air defense system holds together, under the weight of sheer numbers. If the system fails to prioritize correctly, the outcome would likely shift from a controlled defensive action to a desperate struggle for survival. In this hypothetical engagement, the exchange is the moment where doctrine meets the violent reality of kinetic impact. Analysis suggests that despite the high technical proficiency of the United States Navy, the laws of probability in a high-density environment would likely result in successful strikes on both sides. In this scenario, the strike group would likely inflict devastating losses on the Iranian swarm, but it would not emerge unscathed. As the swarm enters the knife fight range of less than 2,000 yards, the United States destroyers would likely be forced to use every weapon in their inventory. Wargame models predict that the 5-inch deck guns, firing fragmentation rounds at a rate of 20 rounds per minute, would be highly effective at neutralizing the smaller fast boats. However, the sheer volume of the Iranian attack would likely mean that while 20 boats are destroyed, 10 would continue to close the distance. In this hypothetical, we must analyze the leakers that bypass the close-in weapons system. If an Iranian anti-ship cruise missile, such as the Noor, were to strike an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the result would likely be a mission kill. While the ship's sophisticated damage control teams would likely prevent it from sinking, the impact would likely destroy the sensitive AN/SPY-6 radar arrays, or the vertical launch system cells. In this scenario, one of the carrier's primary escorts would likely be forced to withdraw from the formation, creating a gap in the carrier's defensive perimeter. Analysis suggests that the carrier itself would likely become the target of a coordinated strike from multiple vectors. If a suicide unmanned surface vessel were to strike the carrier's hull at the waterline, the resulting explosion would likely cause significant internal damage. While the double hull construction of a Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier is designed to withstand such impacts, the shock of the blast could misalign the sensitive electromagnetic catapults or damage the elevators used to move aircraft to the flight deck. On the Iranian side, the losses would likely be catastrophic. Defense analysts have noted that the first salvo doctrine requires the attacker to be willing to sacrifice the majority of their force to achieve a single hit. In this hypothetical engagement, it is predicted that over 70% of the Iranian fast boat flotilla would be destroyed within the first 10 minutes of combat. The combination of FA-18 Super Hornet fire, destroyer deck guns, and helicopter-launched Hellfire missiles would likely turn the surface of the water into a graveyard of burning carbon fiber hulls. However, the exchange reveals a critical United States vulnerability: the exhaustion of ready-to-fire ammunition. After the first wave is neutralized, the destroyers would likely have empty vertical launch system cells and overheated close-in weapon system barrels. Analysis indicates that rearming these systems is impossible while at sea in a combat zone. This means that if the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy were to launch a second wave immediately following the first, the strike group's defensive capacity would be significantly degraded. This phase of the analysis highlights the honest cost of modern naval warfare. The United States Navy holds the advantage in terms of survivability and lethality, but it is not a zero-loss environment. In this scenario, the exchange would likely result in hundreds of casualties on the Iranian side and dozens of sailors lost or injured on the United States side. The destruction of the Iranian flotilla would be a tactical success, but the damage to a multi-billion-dollar destroyer or the partial disabling of the carrier would represent a significant strategic setback for the United States. Analysts believe that the psychological impact of this exchange would be as significant as the physical damage. For the first time in decades, a peer or near-peer adversary would have proven that the Aegis shield can be dented. In this hypothetical, the exchange ends when the remaining Iranian forces, having exhausted their primary munitions and lost their command and control vessels, begin to withdraw toward the cover of their coastal batteries. In this hypothetical outcome, the United States Navy would likely retain operational control of the Strait of Hormuz. But the victory would be characterized by naval analysts as one achieved at a sobering price. If this engagement were to occur, the primary objective of the carrier strike group to maintain freedom of navigation would be technically met, but the strategic narrative would be fundamentally altered by the damage sustained during the exchange. Wargame models predict that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely suffer nearly total destruction of the forces committed to the swarm. Analysis suggests that approximately 25 of the 30 fast attack craft involved would be neutralized, with the remainder forced to retreat into the radar shadows of the Iranian coastline. The loss of these platforms, while significant in numbers, would likely be viewed by Iranian leadership as an acceptable trade for the damage inflicted upon the strike group. On the United States side, the analysis indicates a high probability of at least one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer being mission-killed. In this scenario, the ship would likely remain afloat due to advanced damage control procedures. But its combat systems, including its AN/SPY-6 radar and vertical launch system, would be rendered inoperable. This ship would likely require a multi-year overhaul, effectively removing a critical asset from the global force structure for the foreseeable future. The aircraft carrier itself would likely suffer what analysts call a partial mission kill if the flight deck were struck by even a single low-yield missile or the shock of a nearby explosion. The United States Navy would likely be forced to suspend flight operations. In this hypothetical, FA-18 Super Hornets already in, the air would be forced to divert to land-based airfields in neighboring countries, as the carrier would no longer be able to recover them safely. This would leave the strike group temporarily without its organic air cover, a vulnerability that would dictate an immediate withdrawal from the immediate engagement zone. Analysis suggests that personnel losses would be a defining feature of this outcome. In a high-intensity maritime engagement, the cost in human lives is unavoidable. Defense analysts have noted that the casualties sustained on both sides would likely shock the international community and create immediate political pressure for a ceasefire. The United States would hold the Strait, but the sight of a damaged carrier and a crippled destroyer would challenge the long-standing perception of naval invincibility in the region. Furthermore, the expenditure of precision munitions would be staggering. In this scenario, the strike group would likely have exhausted its entire immediate supply of Standard Missile 6 and Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. This would leave the group in a defensive deficit, unable to withstand a second similar attack without being resupplied, a process that would require the group to leave the operational area for several days. Ultimately, the outcome would likely be a tactical victory for the United States Navy, but a strategic success for the Iranian doctrine of deterrence. By proving that the Aegis shield can be saturated and that American steel can be damaged by low-cost assets, the adversary would achieve their goal of making future deployments into the Strait a much more calculated and high-risk decision. The stability returned to the waterway would be fragile, overshadowed by the reality of what it costs to maintain. This hypothetical engagement provides a sobering look at the reality of modern naval warfare in littoral or coastal waters. While the United States Navy holds a significant technological advantage, this analysis suggests that geography and the physics of saturation can act as powerful equalizers. If this scenario were to occur, several key lessons would likely reshape naval doctrine for decades to come. First, the primary lesson is the problem of magazine depth. In this scenario, the carrier's defense was not defeated by a more advanced weapon, but by the sheer volume of low-quality targets. Wargame models consistently indicate that even the most advanced vertical launch system is a finite resource. Once a destroyer exhausts its interceptors on a swarm of fast boats and drones, it is effectively removed from the defensive network. This highlights an urgent need for high-capacity defensive systems, such as directed energy weapons or high-power microwaves, which do not rely on missiles. Second, this analysis underscores the limitations of high-end sensors in a cluttered environment. The gray zone transition demonstrated that radar systems designed to track supersonic missiles in the open ocean can be challenged by small, low-profile targets weaving through commercial traffic. If these forces were to meet, the ability of the adversary to use maritime clutter to mask their intent would likely remain a persistent tactical advantage. Third, the concept of the mission kill as a strategic victory is validated in this model. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy does not need to sink a carrier to achieve its objectives. By simply damaging the flight deck or disabling a single escort, they can force a strike group to withdraw, achieving a localized sea denial victory. In the language of deterrence, the ability to inflict shocking damage on a high-value American asset is often more important than the tactical survival of the attacking force. For real-world policy, this analysis suggests that the United States may need to reconsider how it projects power in narrow waterways. The traditional carrier-centric model is highly effective for global power projection. But in the Strait of Hormuz, it places a massive percentage of national prestige in a very small and vulnerable basket. Analysts suggest that a shift toward distributed lethality using smaller, more numerous, and expendable unmanned platforms might be necessary to counter the swarming threat without risking capital ships. Finally, the regional implications of such an engagement would be profound. If Iran were to prove that its asymmetric doctrine could successfully dent a carrier strike group, the balance of power in the Middle East would shift. The perceived cost of intervention would rise, potentially granting regional actors more room for maneuver. This scenario teaches us that in modern naval combat, the winner is not always the side with the best technology, but the side that best manages the relationship between cost, risk, and volume. The United States would hold the strait, but at a price that would shock the American public and fundamentally change the calculus of future deployments in this region. That gap between expectation and reality is itself the most important finding of this analysis. This analysis is based on publicly available information. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. This is a hypothetical scenario,